A couple of weeks ago, I talked about the structure of narratives. That a story has three parts: introduction, complication, and a resolution. The introduction, it sets the scene, it orients you to the setting in which the story is going to take place. The complication, it sets out the problem, the main issue that's going to need fixing. And the resolution, well, it tells you how that problem is solved. In Esther, the book of Esther, it's the first two chapters that actually are the introduction. They set the scene. The main complication comes in Esther 3. It's Haman's decision to annihilate God's people. Now I want to pause for a moment to think about that complication in terms of the Bible's overall narrative. So there, in the Bible, the setting is creation, in Genesis 1 and 2. The main complication is human rebellion, that Adam and Eve reject God's rule and they decide that they themselves are going to be the ones who determine what is best for themselves. That's Genesis 3. And then the resolution of that is what God does to solve this issue of human rebellion. And that's what the rest of the Bible is all about. So in Genesis 12, God says that he's going to work through Abraham and his descendants. And through them, he's going to achieve this resolution, that through them he will bless all peoples on the earth. Now in Esther chapter 3, Haman plots to annihilate all Abraham's descendants who are living within the Persian Empire. In other words, Haman appears to threaten the fulfillment of God's promise. He probably doesn't know he's doing that. He just thinks he's getting revenge on his own personal enemy, or perhaps revenge on the enemies of his ancestors. But effectively, this is a threat to the fulfillment of God's promise. What is God going to do about it? Well, last week, Chris took us through the first part of the resolution of this main complication in the book of Esther. We began to see what God did to deliver his people. Indeed, we saw that God was resolving this problem even before the problem arose. See, as Mordecai told Esther in chapter 4, verse 14, who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this. Now Mordecai, as we saw last week, challenged Esther to go to the king and to plead for the lives of her people. And Esther resolved that she would do that. But within that, we're also introduced to a further complication, a new point of tension. See, narratives very rarely follow a straight line. There's usually all sorts of twists and turns along the way. New complications come up that need to be solved before the main complication can be resolved. In Esther 4, the new complication is that Esther must actually risk her own life in order to even have the opportunity to get to plead with the king for the lives of her people, for the lives of the Jew. She can't just walk up to the king and sort of whisper in his ear. She has to wait for him to hold out the golden scepter. And if he doesn't do that, she dies. She doesn't get to plead her case. Now, this particular point of tension is actually resolved quite quickly in the opening verses of Esther 5. So the king not only holds out the golden scepter, he also shows that he's actually very pleased with Esther. He tells her that he'll give her up to half his kingdom. That is, he encourages her not to be shy in telling him what her request is. But apparently it seems that she still is shy. She merely asks the king to come to this banquet that she's prepared and to bring Haman along as well. Why doesn't she strike while the iron is hot? Why didn't she take that opportunity to plead for the lives of the Jews while the king was obviously in a good mood towards her? Why didn't she step in and take what seems to be a God-given opportunity? I think we need to realise the difficult task that Esther had. See, the narrator Well, he focuses our attention on this issue of her risking her life even by going into the king uninvited. Now, we wouldn't have known about that if he hadn't have told us. But we should be able to work out for ourselves that the actual risk to her life is not over at that point. She's trying to get a royal edict overturned. Who initiated that edict? Haman. Who's he? Well, he's the second most powerful person in the empire. The king is the one who put Haman into this position. This man is pleased to the king in the past. This man is important to the king, probably far more important than one of the king's wives. And who was it that signed the royal edict? Well, it was authorised with the king's own ring. The narrator has told us, his readers, that the king didn't bother to read all the fine print before he allowed his ring to be fixed to it, but his nobles don't know that. See, this is the king's command that the couriers took out to every province in the empire. Will it please Xerxes to overturn one of his own commands? Does the king make mistakes when he enacts the laws of the Medes and the Persians? And if he does, will he willingly admit it? See, I think Esther has realised that a public place like the King's Hall is not the appropriate place to make this particular request. And so she invited the king to a more private setting. She's already prepared this banquet before she even went in to approach the king. Now, the narrator passes over the details of the meal itself and gets straight on to the after-dinner drinks. Xerxes again asks Esther, "What's your request?" And once again, he indicates that he really would like to give her this request. But unlike Xerxes knows that Esther wants something other than his company in a banquet. But unlike the reader, he has no clue what she wants. It's still a complete mystery to him. And it's still a mystery as to why she wants Haman there as well. That must have puzzled him a fair bit. Why doesn't she just want a nice quiet candlelit dinner with the king himself? And it still remains a mystery to him, for Esther merely asks him to attend yet another banquet and bring Haman along once again. When she tells him, "Yeah, you're right. I haven't told you yet what my real request is, but I'll do that at the next banquet." In the meantime, there's another complication, a further twist in the plot. Haman, he's in a good mood when he leaves Esther's banquet. Why wouldn't he be? He's at the top of his career path. He's just enjoyed a fine private banquet with the king and the queen. And he's drunk some nice wine. And then his mood is shattered at the sight of one man who refuses to honour him. And it fills him with rage. When the queen honours him, but not this Jew. He won't do it. Nevertheless, he restrains himself until he gets home. And then he calls together his friends and his wife, his advisors, and he boasts to them about his great achievements, his vast wealth and his many sons, and the ways in which the king has honoured him, and his elevation above everybody else. His wife and his friends, they'd already know all of that. But then Haman adds something new for them, something that they don't know about yet, this latest honour that's been given to him. Haman tells them that he's got to go to Esther's private banquet just for him and the king. And what's more, she's invited him to another banquet the next day. But then he gets to the real reason that he called them together. So despite all these magnificent blessings, he's dissatisfied. Why? Well, because the Jew Mordecai still lives and still refuses to honour him. Now, his advisors provide the solution. Get the king to execute Mordecai. Publicly humiliate him in the process. And Haman agrees. Sounds like a good plan to him. And he assumes it's not going to be any problem getting permission from King Xerxes to execute this plan. And so we've got this new tension. Will Esther's delay in telling the king her request cost Mordecai his life? Now, will she perhaps succeed in saving the Jews and lose Mordecai? Now, at this point, I think it's likely that the narrator presents Haman as a negative moral example. Now, overall, I don't think he does present the characters as examples, but I think this might be an exception. Now, I may be wrong about that, because the narrator still does not comment directly. But he does seem to draw our attention to this particular aspect of Haman's character. Now, he refers to all of Haman's boasts. He shows us that Haman has this great desire for personal honour. And in the next chapter, chapter 6, we have the only occasion in the book where the narrator tells us a character's inner words to himself. He says, Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honour than me? See, for the reader who knows the scriptures, what Haman does here calls to mind the proud and arrogant man of Proverbs. And the warnings of Proverbs should come to mind. The Lord detests all the proud of heart. Be sure of this, they're not going to go unpunished. Or again, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And so the challenge is to us as readers, are you proud? Well, not just are you proud like Haman. I suspect we'd all be able to excuse ourselves and say, no, we're not that bad. We can look at this particular example and maybe even feel good about ourselves, maybe even proud, but we're not as wicked as Haman. But God detests all the proud of heart, not just those who are as proud as Haman. Why? Because pride is at the heart of all sin. Pride is the attitude behind that initial rebellion back in Genesis 3. Pride says, I know better than God. I can determine for myself what's best for me, what I think is right and wrong for me. See, pride is at the very heart of what it is that God wants to rescue us from. And so it's good for us to examine our inner thinking. Where is there evidence of pride? Do I value myself on the basis of what I achieve? Do I try to impress other people? Am I worried all the time about what others are thinking of me? Do I look down on others? Or even, do I think I'm useless? Where do I still think that I know better than God? In chapter 6, the scene shifts to the king's bedchamber, and the king can't sleep. Why not? Is it indigestion from Esther's banquet? Is he perhaps trying to work out what it is that Esther is going to ask for? The narrator doesn't tell us. What he does tell us is this series of coincidences that appear to point to God's hidden involvement in what's going on. See, Xerxes is sleepless on the very night that Haman decides to execute Mordecai. And then instead of turning to his harem, Xerxes decides to use this time to listen to the record of his reign. And as he listens, Xerxes just happens to hear the account of Mordecai saving his life and discovers that he didn't reward Mordecai. He didn't do anything to honour him. And that failure, the king's failure to reward Mordecai, is a very significant oversight, even a source of dishonour for Xerxes himself. See, Persian kings were usually very keen to reward those who reported plots against the king's life because that encouraged others to also report when they heard those sorts of things going on. And so Xerxes is now very keen to rectify the fact that he has not rewarded Mordecai. And true to form, Xerxes looks for advice about what reward he should give Mordecai. Now, presumably, as Xerxes was sleepless during the night, it took the readers some time before they reached the account of Mordecai, and it's now the early morning. And so the king, he says, well, who's in the court? Who's available to advise me? And that introduces the next coincidence. Haman just happens to be waiting in the court. Now, ironically, he wants to get Xerxes' permission to execute Mordecai, this man that the king now wants to honour. And so Xerxes asks this second most powerful man in his kingdom for his advice. And the scene is humorous. I mean, Haman thinks the king wants to honour him. And he's so excited at this prospect that he launches into his advice without even observing the normal royal protocol, the normal court protocol. He doesn't use any words like, well, if it pleases the king. Or maybe by this stage he's so confident of the king's favour and friendship that he feels that those sort of protocols no longer apply to him. And so the reader, we as the readers, we know that these two men understand this conversation very differently. I mean, Xerxes, he knows that he refers to Mordecai, but Haman thinks that Xerxes is referring to Haman. And so Haman gives his advice based on his own desires. This is the way he wants Xerxes to honour Haman. He already has riches and position. What he craves is public honour, recognition. He wants others to know how important he is to the king. And again, true to form, Xerxes accepts the advice he's given. He tells Haman to do exactly what he has just advised, and to do it for Mordecai, the Jew. You see, the great reversal is obvious, isn't it? Haman enters into the king's court that morning in order to get permission to execute Mordecai. He thinks he's going to remove this one source of dissatisfaction that's in his life. And Haman thinks that Xerxes is about to further honour him. I mean, he's already puffed up with the honour of being invited to Esther's banquets. Now he thinks the king is going to honour him even further still. And then he discovers that Xerxes wants to honour Mordecai, Haman's enemy. And what's more, Haman is the one who must cause this to happen. And to parade Mordecai through the streets, Haman himself must be the one to proclaim Mordecai's honour. And so Haman is humiliated in his own eyes. Haman has been unable to force Mordecai to honour him, but now he is forced to honour Mordecai. And so Haman's plot against Mordecai is foiled. For he can't now go to the king and ask permission to execute this man that the king has just honoured so publicly. He's going to have to wait for the day that's been appointed in the edict for when all the Jews will be annihilated. But notice how this particular complication has been resolved. See, does Mordecai do anything to fix the problem? Does Esther do anything? No. I mean, this whole problem arises and then disappears between Esther's two banquets. God works behind the scenes not only to preserve Mordecai's life, but also to have him in place for the role that he's going to play in chapter 8. And God doesn't use any miracles on this occasion. He works through the ordinary events of life and the everyday decisions of the different people who are involved. Now, the narrative moves fairly quickly at this point. Haman goes home and he gets more advice from his friends. Very different advice to what they gave earlier. They show that they can read the omens of the time very well. They tell him that his downfall has already begun and that it's going to continue. And they're right. And by the end of the day, Haman is going to be dead. Haman is then taken off to Esther's second banquet. And again, the narrator takes us straight to the after-dinner drinks. Xerxes still wants to know what Esther's request is. And he again indicates to her that he's very willing, very, very willing to give her whatever it is she wants. And this time she does tell him what she wants. She wants her own life and the lives of her people. Xerxes is enraged. He storms out into the palace garden. Now the narrator tells us how Haman evaluates this situation. He thinks he's already condemned, that the king has already made his decision, that he's just deciding the most agonising way to kill Haman. But Haman's having a bad day. And now his advisors have already told him that it's going to go downhill for him from here on in. What's Esther thinking at this point? Well, we're not told. But she has hidden her nationality from the king. And now she is accused to the king's favourite advisor. Nor are we told what the king is thinking. Now, I think it's likely that he's still trying to work everything out. Esther has, she's only accused Haman, but the king's not stupid. He knows he's the one who signed the edict. He's sort of between a rock and a hard place. How can he execute Haman and not lose face? And what has Haman actually done that's been wrong? I mean, yes, he's proud and he's boastful and he's attacked these Jewish people, but what Persian law has he broken? I mean, he didn't mean to threaten the queen's life, and Xerxes is just as guilty of that as Haman is. Haman solves the problem for the king. It's another one of these coincidences. The king returns to the room at the exact time that Haman commits this huge breach of protocol. He gets far too close to one of the king's harem, in this case, the queen herself. And the king exaggerates his actions. And so they execute Haman for a crime that had nothing to do with his edict against the Jews. By the end of Esther 7, that issue, that complication is still unresolved. The edict still stands. Jewish lives are not saved. We find about that later. This narrative is written to encourage God's people to remember God's commitment to fulfill his promises. All sorts of threats will arise from all sorts of sources. I mean, some of them even arise from God's people themselves. But God will remain faithful to his promises. He works through the everyday events of life and the various decisions of all sorts of people, decisions that they freely make themselves. And he orchestrates all these things to achieve his purposes and to fulfill his promises. Now, for us as God's people today, those promises, they centre on what God has done for us and what he is doing for us through Jesus. Jesus provides God's final solution to the problem of Genesis 3. See, God promises deliverance to those who trust in Jesus, deliverance from our rebellion against him and from the consequences of that rebellion. He says that he will bring to completion that work of deliverance that he has begun in us. He says that he will use all the situations of our lives to achieve his good purposes for us. And he says nothing can separate us from his love. Now, we often don't recognise exactly how God is fulfilling his promises to us, exactly how he is working in our lives to continue to deliver us from our rebellion against him. And we don't always see the divine coincidences that he brings about. We often don't understand why he allows us to go through difficulties and suffering. But our task is to trust him, that Jesus has already completed the more difficult bit by dying in our place, and that he will complete the process of removing that rebellion from us. Now, that doesn't mean that we're inactive, so just sitting back and waiting for him to complete his work. No, he calls us to active involvement in the task, that we turn away from our rebellious thoughts and deeds and allow the fruit of the Spirit to grow within us, that we deny our self-centered natures and follow the path that Jesus sets before us. That we seek to understand God's purposes in his world, and we get involved in what it is that God is doing in his world. And that we tell others about the deliverance that Jesus makes available to everyone. Now, we don't always know exactly what we should do in every situation. Like Esther here, we don't always get a direct word from God. But that should not leave us doing nothing. Rather, we seek to understand God's word as best we can. We ask God for his strength and his help, and we press forward on the basis of what we believe it is that God wants us to do day by day.